We can now bring in Andrew Smith, lecturer in liberal arts at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Politically speaking, is Emmanuel Macron in a better position or worse off than he was a year ago?
It's a difficult one to say, but I think we would have to come down to the fact that great gamble, that big bet that Macron placed when he tried to dissolve the assembly was not a success for him. And I think one of the clearest signs that this was not a success is the fact that, even today we have the far right meeting and celebrating what they're calling a victory day to commemorate the European results, the European election results that led initially to Macron dissolving the parliament a year ago. Now, that's a really important thing because despite all of this, despite all of, two governments, despite all this debate, despite all this hot air, essentially, we've been in a situation of immobilism since last year. And we still have the three same blocs in Parliament, a big kind of centrist majority, essentially, or well, no longer a majority, I should say, but a centrist group surrounded by the New Popular Front on the left, now no longer perhaps as united as it was a year ago, and on the right by the far right, emboldened by the successes in the electoral results, and who continue to be emboldened largely by the normalisation of many of their policies and their vocabulary by the right. I think it's really telling. You look at Sacha Houlier, one of the deputies who was a disaffected Macroniste, and one of the points being made was that the far right, the National Rally, is now one of the components nearly of all the majorities that emerge in Parliament. Most of the texts that are being voted are supported by them. They are really the ones that are almost guaranteeing this government in place. And so really, is Macron in a better place? I think the answer undoubtedly is no. We're a year further ahead and not much has happened since then. Despite all the headlines, all the tumult, all the difficulties, progress has been slim on the ground.
Let's talk about the far right for a second, because you said they're not in government, yet it seems that they are the ones calling the shots, because they essentially are propping up the government when it comes to passing any bills, or they have to support it or not. As you said, we have the far right's Marine Le Pen, who's hosting a victory day with like-minded Europeans, whether it's Spain's Vox or the Matteo Salvini from Italy. Viktor Orban, her close friend, is in town as well. What is this country going to see in 2 years' time when we have a presidential election? Is it going to be the far right up against the far left, or have those fractures on the left sort of weakened it?
Well, it's a really difficult moment. I think one of the difficulties you have, especially on the far right, is let's not kind of forget much of what this new election, this next election in 2027 will look like has yet to be defined. We know that Emmanuel Macron cannot stand again as the incumbent. He served his 2 terms. We know as things stand that Marine Le Pen cannot stand because she has been deemed ineligible when the court found her guilty of embezzlement of public funds as part of a wider system of embezzlement that her party was conducting in Europe. Now, of course, that's being appealed. Of course, that appeal will be held. And so it may well be that she reappears as a candidate. In the meantime, however, we know that she's not very pleased about the fact that Jordan Bardella, her number 2, is the sort of the heir apparent. There was a big kind of concern last month when a conservative far-right supporter polled to find out who would be supported and put Bardella in as the candidate for the National Rally. Now, in part, what they're doing today, this rally, this victory rally, they're calling it, is in some ways about shoring up their own alliance. It's a little show of support between Bardella and Le Pen. It's about finding their friends in Europe and trying to celebrate, in the wake of Donald Trump's victory, that this is a moment when the far right is really emboldened. That nationalist international is really taking a lot of strength from these types of, dominance in the US in terms of that types of politics. On the other hand, we've seen actually that Bardella has done quite well in terms of his, popularity when polled. It's really he's being polled against Edouard Philippe, who is the seemingly heir apparent when it comes to the idea of what will happen in terms of the centrist candidate. If we look to the centre-right, we'll see other people like presumably Bruno Retailleau, the current interior minister, recently kind of elected at the head of his party. We've seen similar in the Socialist Party, of course, but that remains to be seen what's going to happen on the far left. And if they can kind of refined that unity that led them to put together that same candidate. Of course, you'll find many of those people that were on the New Popular Front out in force protesting against that rally of the far right that's happening today in Montargis. And actually, that's one of the big things. Will it be an anti-far left coalition that comes together, or an anti-far right coalition that comes together? And which will be the one that actually rises to dominance in the next presidential election?
And I want to ask, because at this, you touched on this, we have members of Emmanuel Macron's own government, like Bruno Retailleau, who's not a part of Emmanuel Macron's party, but is of the right-wing Les Républicains party. He has his eye on the presidency. It's no secret. Gérald Darmanin, who's now the justice minister, has his eyes on the presidency. How does the president go about keeping these men in check?
It's a really difficult one. We've seen this before with the ambitions of people in government and how they measure up against the presidency. We might even argue that's one of the reasons that Edouard Philippe found himself outside government in the first place. Of course, a very popular prime minister, perhaps more popular than a president who he served. And one of the things that's got to happen is really there's going to be a balance. Of course, they are in government. They are working for the prime minister. They are trying to work to deliver the government's agenda. The president really is trying to sort of at times intervene and throw himself into perhaps issues that he doesn't need to get involved. We've seen that recently in terms of trying to draw people from New Caledonia around the crisis there and bring them back to Paris to have a big summit. You know, he's sort of sticking his fingers into policy that should be handled by ministers. So Emmanuel Macron really is going to have to look to sort of checking the ambitions of some of these people. But likewise, he's not, I think, he's not set against the ambitions of many of these people on the centre right, as long as they define themselves against what the far right has tried to do. And Bruno Retailleau has done that in the past. Of course, he was kind of friendly and rivals with Eric Ciotti in the past. Ciotti, of course, went to the side of the far right and distanced himself in the centre. Retailleau has tried to hold that down, even as he has sort of taken on some of the language of the far right and made those kind of normalised those concepts and policies. So there's a real difficulty. Who will be the standard bearer for the centre? Who will actually find themselves? Of course, Macron's vision of uniting the socialists and the Republicans in a sort of centrist embrace has really fallen away. That's a very difficult card to play, again, third time round. And it's really difficult to see how Edouard Philippe would manage to bring that about. I think ultimately it's very likely that we'll find ourselves in a situation where we have someone like Philippe facing off against a far-right candidate in the second round of the election in 2027.
Okay.
The precise shape of that race is yet to come, and there's lots more ground yet to run in that race for the presidency.
It's interesting that you see Edouard Philippe will be the Macron successor. We'll see how that pans out on that front. But I just want to know what you think Macron will do now, because essentially, as you said, he's doing things that ministers should be doing. He's obviously has the international diplomatic portfolio as the French president, but he is essentially a lame duck. So what does he do now, given that there's this policy paralysis in the National Assembly? Does he dissolve Parliament once again and see where the chips fall, or does he ride it out to 2027?
Well, I mean, that's really the accusation of what's going on in the Assembly right now. People say that ministers right now are either waiting because they think, well, maybe another dissolution comes along, or, you know, worst things come to the worst, we'll wait for another president. What can happen? Really, you cannot have a parliament in stasis. Now, we know that Emmanuel Macron will once again come into the power, the ability to dissolve Parliament again in July. Of course, the year's anniversary since that second round of the legislative elections last time. Indications are right now that he's not thinking of doing it. But, I mean, what were the indications last time? It seemed like a spur of the moment. He said it was like a grenade he was throwing at the feet of people in Parliament, so they would assume their responsibilities. 1 year on, I don't think you can say that this has been a success. 1 year on, I don't think you can say that people have assumed their responsibilities in Parliament. If Bayrou has managed to actually push through any policies, it's been because there was a lack of ambition to really do much at all. And so I think we're looking at a kind of Parliament of really small concessions, of grand drama in terms of rhetoric and all the rest of it, but really of people trying to position themselves now for that race to come. And I don't think that's good news for the French people, because if we can say that this dissolution did anything Perhaps what it did most is, convince French people that they were not finding themselves satisfied by what was happening in politics, severing that link between the ballot box and the duty of the assembly. And if there is anything I think that politicians need to do, is to realise and take up those responsibilities in Parliament to deliver the types of things that their voters looked for. And sometimes that might mean looking to the left. It might mean drawing those in to actually support politics. And that really has to be something that falls on Parliament. We can't constantly look at the president to kind of govern in this way. This is the duty of the National Assembly. But it's a very difficult ask to find that in such a divided Parliament.
Andrew, we have municipal elections between now and 2027. Can we expect the far right to make inroads once again, as they have not just in France but around Europe?
A really difficult one. We've seen, sadly, the horrible instances of those racist murders in Navarre very recently. And really the idea is that there continue to be a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of disconnection between politics, between those who are maybe not engaged in the communal life of their municipality.
But do you think that
it,
anti-migrant rhetoric will continue? Or given that we've seen these murders recently, will that sort of simmer down?
I don't think there's any reason that this would simmer down. There's shock, there's horror, there's all these things. But of course, that's not touching the people that are suddenly kind of spouting this rhetoric. I don't think we'll see politicians rein it in. I think this rally that's going on with the far right today shows us that they are loud and proud and continue to pour that poison into French political debate. It is the job of Parliament, of the Assembly, to reject that language of poison, to stop normalising the ideas of the far right, and to isolate the type of climate of hatred, which was decried by Bruno Retailleau just so recently. So no, I don't think that will, somehow disappear in the run-up to the municipal elections. And I think it's something that we have to fight against in terms of politics and the language of politics. Be clear about the impact, the horrible impact at times, of that type of language.
Andrew Smith, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.